back to business.
I assume that's all getting cut. I can't imagine you want like a 5 minute aside on Radiohead.
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Christopher Such,
Hello again.
and we're going to focus our attention on, surprise, surprise, reading.
Yep, looking forward to it. Just realised, are we doing a what you're reading for? Because I haven't got a what you're reading for prepared, but I can get one if you want.
No, this is all about the work you've been doing over the last year or so and what it means for teachers in the classroom. Normally we get straight into things, but some very exciting news for listeners. Well, I think it's exciting. Hopefully they'll find it exciting too. On January 18th, 2025 in Bromley, London, we're going to be holding the first ever Thinking Deeply About Primary Education conference. We're going to be donating all the profits to Velindre Cancer Centre, which is obviously a charity very close to our Tadape hearts. And Chris, you're going to be talking about reading at this. This is almost an exclusive, the first session announcement. What are you going to be talking about?
Yeah, so I'm going to be delivering kind of like the most recent iteration, because it's something that's always developing, of what every teacher needs to know about reading. I mean, when I first started delivering a session like this, it was very theory based, and over time it's become more and more practical. So yeah, I'm looking forward to speaking on that subject. It's one that's obviously I'm really interested in.
And we're obviously very grateful that you would give your time so generously. I'm going to stick a link to the tickets and also the session proposal in the description of this episode. So if anyone wants to speak and share their deep thinking over the last few years, that'd be fantastic. But equally, if you want to bring your colleagues along and share the thing, we'll raise money for a really great charity. I think they help over 1.5 million people sort of in the battle against cancer, and also having a fantastic CPD at the same time. So what's not to like? Down to business. You've written another book on the same subject. Is this because you messed up the first one?
Yeah, you could make that argument. I'm always slightly suspicious when someone writes a book on the same subject, Kieran Mackle. But but basically, I have something new to communicate. So originally, when I wrote the first book, I had learned quite a lot about what's come to be known as the science of reading. I'd taught reading in every primary year group, and on the basis of those two things together, I wanted to share what I understood about reading so that schools could take that information and go in their own direction more confidently when it comes to, an approach to reading. Over the past few years, having worked with quite a lot of schools and having become a reading consultant and working for Ambition Institute, designing their NPQ in leading literacy, my whole world has become reading and literacy more broadly, but mostly reading. And having supported lots of schools to change how they teach reading and having communicated with countless teachers and school leaders, I find that there are a lot of people out there that want more than just a set of evidence-based principles that they can use to derive their own approach to reading. Lots and lots and lots of schools basically ask the question, okay, but how do you do this? How do you organize the teaching of reading in a classroom? How do you assess and address reading difficulties systematically? How do you nurture a reading culture? How do you build a reading curriculum itself, etc., etc.? And rather than distance myself from that and say, well, there are a set of principles and there's no right way, what I wanted to do with this book was to say, cards on the table, this is how I would attempt to do all of this stuff, and beyond, and more importantly, this is how I have done all of this stuff. In almost all of the cases of what's included in the book, it's stuff that I put into practice in schools that I worked in. The very heart of the book, which is all about how to teach reading, how to deliver professional development on that subject, etc. That is stuff that I can fairly confidently say at this point is tried and tested across hundreds of schools. They seem really happy with how things have gone. And so the short version is this is a book trying to put myself out of business because I work with lots of schools. I help them to change how they teach reading. And I generally think that while I like to think that the help I give is useful, I think a lot of schools are ready to have just a manual for making those sorts of changes rather than have me there to support.
I even get questions about this in like the comments on YouTube, the comments in Spotify or whatever. So I can only imagine how many people are asking you about this stuff. I mean, I'm really pleased that you've chosen to do this because there was a while where you were playing with the idea of sort of veering into early mathematics and primary mathematics. And I was like, hold on a second, Chris, you've already got reading.
Yeah, well, I don't think that would have been the most sensible of ideas. One of my first loves when it came to education was the teaching of mathematics. It's still arguably my favourite subject to teach, but no, I don't think I could do what you do to anything like the same standard. So I think it was very wise of me to stay in my niche.
That is the correct answer. Well done, Chris. What needs to be included in reading lessons for them to be effective? And how does this compare to what you've commonly seen in schools?
So, as I mentioned before, I've over the last few years, I've had countless conversations, lots of them on Zoom, lots of them in person at conferences and professional development sessions. I think I spend, maybe 5 to 10 hours a week either replying to emails or direct messages on Twitter or Blue Sky. And there are quite clear patterns in what I see across English schools. Generally, I find that when the subject comes around to things like initial decoding and the initial development of spoken language and experience with books, basically the most important things in those first stages of learning to read, schools are pretty happy with that. They're pretty confident with their phonics program, etc. What I then find, though, is that they are far less confident in understanding what they think should come next. So they've always got something in place, but often what exists there has come about through either a sense of inertia or just something they found online that seems to make sense. And the most commonly what I find is that the way of teaching reading lessons, so putting aside phonics and spelling and reading across the curriculum for a moment, but that bit of curriculum time that's dedicated to the teaching of reading, that stuff is mostly reverse engineered from SATs. So the domains that exist in the assessment framework for SATs have been turned into a set of question types that lots of schools just assume if I can get kids good at answering those kinds of questions, that's what being good at reading is. And that will be, a good way to teach comprehension. And this way of teaching has led to certain things. First, generally, it's led to limited time actually spent reading in reading lessons. Most of the time is spent modeling and practicing how to answer question types. Equally, little attention is often paid as a result of this to the actual texts that pupils are reading. So rather than intentionally accumulating a variety of texts, what you have are a set of extracts taken from a book or taken online, and not a great deal of thought put into what kids are actually reading. It also means often that there's no explicit focus on making sure that pupils get the active decoding practice that they need to become fluent readers. And probably the thing that jumps out most about this approach is just how obviously stultifying it is for the pupils, but also for the teacher. They're often kind of, I would describe almost in a rut with how they teach reading, not really learning anything about how to teach reading better from teaching reading in this way, but not sure what else they might do. Occasionally, there are some schools that aren't doing this, and quite often what they're doing is something else that they've seen online, and they're often doing something quite useful and doing it well, but commonly it's like one thing. So they've come across a program that relates to the teaching of fluency, and they're doing that and they're doing it well, but there isn't the other components of reading that are required for an effective approach. Or it might be that they've gone all in on a faster pace of reading, or they've gone all in on text discussions. And all of these things in isolation are really valuable things, but they've often just got one of these or two of these, and they don't really understand the balance that might be achieved by having these things together. And when I talk about balance, that's what I then advocate to these schools. While I do advocate a particular way of teaching reading, that doesn't mean there is only one way to do it. Any approach can be effective as long as it fulfills three priorities. If it has an explicit focus on fluency development through active decoding, if it makes sure kids are building up their reading experience, and if it makes sure that there are text discussions that allow teachers to share their understanding and to help pupils develop their reading identity and understand that how active they need to be as when they comprehend. If those three priorities are met, then I don't really mind how you teach reading. That said, most schools where I've looked at what they do for the teaching of reading haven't really got those three priorities covered. My way of doing that and something that is at the very heart of the new book is what I call reading lesson structures, which is a different, relatively simple way of teaching reading that matches each of those priorities. So a fluency read that develops fluency, extended read that makes sure pupils get lost in books and develop a real breadth of reading experience, and a close read which focuses on text discussions. The final thing I'll say about these three things and how they kind of balance those priorities is that none of them are new or flashy. If you go to schools around the country and you watch reading, you will see somewhere or other these things happening. You'll see a fluency reading going on through repeated oral reading and modelling and discussion. You'll see a faster pace of reading going on in certain schools, and you will see deeper discussions of texts going on really well in certain schools. What the heart of my book really does is to say, this is how you can put these things into practice, how you can learn them one by one, and crucially, how you can balance them and make sure that they work for every pupil in the room.
Feels like there are almost two groups. There are those who are subscribed to the sort of the approach that you have, I think, dismantled really, really effectively over the countless hours we've chatted about reading on the podcast and in your book. And but there's also those who are embracing your ideas or embracing the ideas that you're a proponent of, but they haven't quite got all of them tied together. As a subject lead, for instance, who say, for instance, they're on board with your approach, which group do you think is more difficult to instigate change in? Is it those who are subscribed to the almost like the comprehension is a separate skill group, or those who are excelling in one area but not in all areas?
Invariably, it's the first group that are more of a challenge, because often there is a sense of, I don't want to say guilt, guilt is too strong, but if you've taught reading a certain way for a number of years and then someone tries to suggest to you that maybe it isn't a particularly effective way to teach reading, it's naturally going to take a bite out of your ego. I mean, I know how that feels. I taught reading in precisely this way for a number of years, and when I started digging into the research and learning more about reading, I was a bit disappointed about the teaching that I'd done. That said, I've been generally really positively surprised in every school and every group of teachers I've worked with at how open teachers are to changes once they begin to understand some of these, once they understand some of the theory behind reading, once they understand that actually the development of comprehension is primarily related to, yes, making sure pupils are fluent readers, but also making sure that pupils know lots and lots about written language and the world that it represents. So, yeah, while one group is possibly take a little more convincing, generally I've been, yeah, really pleased to see how open schools are to doing things in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, obviously being very careful treading the line on your ego. I think the way you explain things and the way you sort of outline the ways in which pupils learn to read and those things are important as a big part of that. I would be less surprised because when people listen to you speak, I mean, think was it May 2021? I really, I taught a reading carousel for a large part of my sort of teaching career, or the when I was had my own classes, and listening to you speak about reading, I learn something new every time. But also, you make it really, really easy for people to get on board with your ideas because it's the high and the why as well. So yes, I think that's a testament to the fine work you've done over the last couple of years.
That's far too generous, but I'll take it as a compliment. Thank you.
What have you learned about changing how reading is taught across a school?
The first thing that I would say for anyone who is in charge of making change across a school, be it in reading or anything else, is that it's well worth checking out the EEF's implementation guidance. Lots of sensible stuff in there. A lot of what I will say over the next couple of minutes aligns quite closely with the advice that that gives. Beyond that, thinking more specifically about reading, when I'm working with a school or about to work with a school, there are a few things that I advise. The first is that they should make sure that reading really is the highest priority at that moment. Because sometimes, or in fact, quite commonly, I'm coming into contact with people because they've recently read my first book or they've seen me present somewhere. And so they've been fired up about reading and they're enthusiastic about it. And it's useful just to double check, especially if they're a reading lead who doesn't necessarily have that bigger picture that a head teacher might have about priorities across the school. It's important to check that this is actually the thing that needs working on most, because reading is obviously exceptionally important. But if reading is in an adequate place, and say the teaching of mathematics or behavior or aspects of formative assessment across the curriculum, if these are just inadequate, then they are likely to be a higher priority than reading at that moment. So that's the first thing. Check that it really is the highest priority. Next is all about creating a plan, having a general sense of, well, how are we going to go about step by step achieving what we want to achieve? And once we've achieved it, what will it look like? What kind of outcomes will we be looking to achieve? And it isn't necessarily just assessment outcomes. It might be, what does that look like in the classroom? What do pupils tell us about their enjoyment of reading lessons? What do teachers tell us about how they are developing as teachers by teaching this way? Ideally, the next step is for the reading lead or someone else, or even a small group, to be scouts. So if you're going to make changes and you want to roll them out across the entire school, it's a really good idea to have had a go at it yourself, or a little team to have had a go at it, to experimented with it, so that when you come to share these ideas more broadly, you've already seen the potential pitfalls, you've already worked out how to get round those, etc. On the assumption that you've done that, if you can, the next is really about getting staff on board. That means sharing rationale for why you want to make changes. What is it about the way you currently teach reading that you think means that it's worth considering changes? And then kind of canvassing opinion, finding out what staff think about the current way of teaching reading, where it might be improved, what bits they actually like and would like to keep, etc. Before then getting into a shared understanding of the underlying theory. So if everyone's on the same page when you talk about reading fluency or comprehension or vocabulary, whatever it might be, it's much easier to make changes in a coherent fashion across the school. Once you've got that shared understanding and you've got teachers on board with the idea that you will be having a go at changing things, it's then trying to introduce changes in a incremental, achievable fashion. So thinking specifically about how I work with schools to roll out reading lesson structures, what we tend to do is stagger them. So we'll look at one of them, look at how it's taught, how it's planned, etc. And then I'll leave a gap of a few weeks at least, so that the individual teachers can go away and experiment with it, can see what it feels like to teach that way in year 2 or year 4 or whatever it might be. So they can come back to me and the school leadership team about those pitfalls, what worked, what support might be helpful. Do they need, for example, to move the timetable around to make sure that, if you're a year 2 group, that you've got one teaching assistant between the 3 classes, can you share a teaching assistant? All of these practical little questions that come up when you experiment with something new. Once teachers are relatively confident with that, then we look at the next lesson structure, stagger that, leave a gap in the same way, go away and experiment before looking at the third. And the idea here is, even if you're not worried about reading lesson structures, the idea of breaking things into chunks that are manageable, that teachers can experiment with first before anyone's coming in to monitor or to give any direct advice or support, just a chance to experiment with these things as they're rolled out incrementally. I think that's really important as well. Central to this as well is teachers having a really clear idea of what it might look like. And that doesn't mean it has to be perfect. It doesn't mean it has to be impressive. In some ways, it's kind of useful if it looks normal and achievable. But one of the great things about having that little team, that scout team, is that you can model bits of teaching. You can say, well, it's nothing special, but this is how the start of a lesson might look, or this is how this part of the lesson might look. You can model that, as I say, in a professional development session, staff meeting, or alternatively, if you're really brave and you have the tech, you could video yourself teaching this lesson and say, look, this is just an example of what this part of a lesson might look like. I guess the final couple of things as this gets, rolled out is that once you then say, okay, this is how we teach reading now, that's when a lot of the work begins. That's when the harder, the stuff that will dent your ego as a reading lead or a school leader, that's when that begins, because it will never look exactly how you wanted it to look. And there will be things you need to deal with and adaptations you need to make. But really, it's about kind of monitoring, offering support, maybe partnering up teachers, those who are finding it relatively easy to take to this, those who are struggling a little bit more, but really being ready to iron out those wrinkles along the way. Now, I said lots of stuff there, but the short version really is read the EEF's implementation guidance because it's really valuable. Have a plan once you know that reading is definitely the priority. Ideally, scout and have a little team that has a go at this stuff. Make sure your team is on board, both with the rationale for changes and the theory behind why you think this is a good idea. And then roll it out incrementally, piece by piece, giving teachers a chance to experiment in a zero pressure environment before eventually saying, okay, yeah, now line in the sand, this is how we teach reading now. And at that point, that's when you begin to think about offering some extra support, monitoring, and adapting where necessary.
I can certainly see why you suggest that it needs to be sort of the main priority, because it's sounds like that certainly in the first year would be an intensive process. How do you imagine, do you put a time limit? Because I always say, like, right, it takes about 3 years to get to a really good place when you're making wholesale changes and when you're implementing sort of an effective approach to whatever the teaching of whatever subject it may be. I mean, in my mind, I imagine 3. Do you have a figure, like a number of years in your head? And how do things change? Is it just monitoring over those sort of subsequent years?
In the back of my mind, I always think that if for a main subject like this, I think ideally you want to place a full academic year's focus on, that's our main priority. Now, this doesn't mean there might not be other stuff going on in the background. You might be rolling out the use of times table rock stars in mathematics. You might be looking at how you use sources in history and other bits and pieces. But as your main professional development focus, the thing you're doing when you're saying to teachers, this is how, we're changing wholesale how we teach reading. I think, as at the back of your mind thinking, this is our main focus for a year, I think is a pretty sensible thing to do. I think after that, it then the kind of the monitoring that goes on with that doesn't really have a time limit. It's pretty much indefinite. It will be, because you'll have new teachers coming into the school. You might want to change the books that are in your reading curriculum. You might like to tweak the approach. That sense of monitoring is obviously at its most intense in that first year, but you are still kind of keeping an eye on it from then on, just as you are with any other area of teaching. But really, in terms of when I'd want this to be from the very beginning to this is embedded, this is what we do now, I think kind of within a couple of terms or at most a year, I think is a pretty sensible timescale. But as I say, often some of the most important work for a reading lead or a senior leader comes after that, through the monitoring, the support, etc. Just one thing I might add to that, though, is that in the reality of schools, You might find, for example, that have got an ECT and they're really struggling with behaviour, and the last thing you want them to do is they've already got an adequate way that they're teaching reading. They're kind of comfortable with it. It fits with how the school previously taught reading, and you might strategically with this teacher say, actually, I want them to be focusing on behaviour right now. I don't want them to be engaging with this in exactly the same way as the rest of the school. Yes, they'll attend the professional development. They'll get a sense of what's going on so that we're priming them for making these changes down the line. But actually, this year, when the rest of the school is getting to grips with this, maybe isn't the right time for this teacher. And that being the case, once this ECT is more settled, they're in their second year, etc., that might be the point at which you say, okay, you remember that professional development we did? We've got this in classrooms across the school. You can go and look at this class, go and look at this class, go and watch them teaching. I can give you extra support. You're going to now try and teach reading in this way as well. And that's outside of that year that I mentioned before, but for the reasons I've described here. So there are always practical realities that might get in the way of you saying, this is my time scale. So there has to be a degree of flexibility in that.
I think it makes a whole lot of sense. I think it'd be really helpful for listeners who are considering this, because there's no ideal school, there's no ideal situation. We're always balancing many things at the same time. So I think that is excellent advice. How do you advise schools to help them assess and address reading difficulties?
So the word I like to use about this is that you need to have a systematic approach to doing this stuff. The challenge really is that at one end of the spectrum, you can say, I'm going to use one of these 100 different assessments. And once I've worked out what specific reading difficulties this pupil has, I'm going to have 20 different potential interventions that are as precisely targeted as individual needs as one can imagine. That's one end of the spectrum, which you might think of as the idealistic, completely unachievable end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is what I see in quite a few schools where they have a reading intervention. Kids are struggling with reading, we have a reading intervention. Now, sometimes this is a program that they buy into that I would say pretends to address all sorts of different reading needs effectively. But often it's kind of like a one-stop shop. If they struggle with reading, this is the intervention that we do. A sensible approach is trying to find the sweet spot between those things where we are adequately assessing individual needs without having to say that every pupil needs one-to-one intervention from a really experienced expert teacher who can identify their precise individual needs and respond to them. So as a general rule, what does that look like? Well, I think that we need to assess certain things. Comprehension assessments are generally, or can be generally, useful for getting a global sense of pupils' reading, giving feedback to parents, making large-scale strategic decisions. Fluency assessments are a really great way to keep track of where the vast majority of pupils are at with their reading. And if they have issues with fluency, then decoding assessments as well, the sort of thing that comes attached to your phonics program, things that often look a bit like the phonics screening check that happens in year one. By having those three assessments, you can get a decent idea of what it is that pupils are struggling with. Now, it's tempting, if they are a relatively fluent reader but struggle a bit with comprehension, it's tempting to say then, oh, okay, we need to look at aspects of language comprehension. I'm going to do a vocabulary intervention or a text structure intervention or whatever it might be. Truth is, we don't really, in almost any school I've seen, have the resources to justify those kinds of interventions. Anything that we really can and should be addressing in the classroom should be addressed there. And the language comprehension stuff is as effectively addressed there as it is in intervention. Really, our interventions that are in response to these assessments that we do have to be targeting foundational aspects of reading. One of those interventions should relate to pupils who don't seem to have any major decoding issues, but they're significantly behind with their fluency. They need reading practice in some form. That might be fluency read with a group of pupils. If you're fortunate enough to have one-to-one reading, it could be that. So a fluency intervention. For those pupils who do have the coding issues, then they will likely need support from the school's phonics program if the issue is a lack of alphabetic code knowledge. It might be a more precise aspect of the coding. It might be that their code knowledge is absolutely fine, but blending is the issue. And then targeted practice of blending, especially words that contain adjacent consonants, lots and lots and lots of that practice is going to be valuable. But really, our interventions should focus on these foundational issues. It should be fluency, if that is the issue, but decoding isn't. If decoding is an issue, then looking at, well, do they need support from the phonics program because they lack code knowledge and the ability to use it? Or if it's just blending, then let's see if we can target that if their code knowledge otherwise is adequate. So any approach to assessment and intervention that divides kids quite roughly into those buckets, I think is a really good place to start. I think it's the most powerful way to use the limited resources we have available for intervention. That would be the one thing I'd add to that is that none of this obviates the need for us to work in tandem with a Senko to identify other issues. While this systematic approach is looking at all pupils working through our school and their development in reading, there will obviously still be the case where we have pupils who have perhaps issues with speech, and then communication between the teacher and the Senko might involve working out whether there are issues relating to, say, developmental language disorder, or whether there are undiagnosed hearing issues, or whatever it might be. So this systematic approach is the thing that we use for all pupils, but then alongside that, we kind of make sure that the expertise of a Senko in our school is helping address anything that goes beyond that into other aspects of literacy.
That footnote almost feeds perfectly into my follow-up, because I'm imagining that keeping track of this can be quite don't know if complex, but certainly complicated. There's a lot to keep track of, and perhaps more so than in other subjects. How do you see the distribution, of the workload with regards to who gets which intervention? When do we test? How regularly do we test? And then who delivers, in your mind, these interventions?
Great question. I mean, there's lots of practical questions that are embedded into that, and I'll try and address all of them. Starting with like the regularity of assessments, I think as a general starting point, I think that fluency assessments twice or three times a year, alongside standardized comprehension assessments twice, three times a year, I think that's a sensible way to do things. If a pupil is in a fluency intervention, I would likely do maybe an extra fluency assessment. If they were, say, only in it for a half term, I might do another fluency assessment at the end of that intervention to keep an eye on progress, to see whether it's doing what we want it to do. But generally, kind of 2 or 3 times a year. I think 3 times a year is ideal, really, especially when it comes to oral reading fluency assessments, because we can do them right at the start of the school year, and it gives a teacher an opportunity to hear every pupil read aloud. And that brings me on to kind of who does this stuff. Well, a standardized comprehension assessment is the sort of thing that you do across your whole class. It takes up a lesson. Kids are reading and answering questions. So that's kind of obviously the teacher's responsibility. I think ideally the first oral reading fluency assessment of the year should be done by a teacher. So in the first kind of week of term, when pupils are perhaps doing some getting to know you activities, maybe there's something where you will have, an art activity or some other kind of activity where you think, they're enjoying this, they are able to work independently. This is a chance for me to spend an hour or an hour and a half hearing every pupil read aloud, getting a sense of whether there are any fluency issues. I think that first one, really valuable for the teacher to do the assessment. I think subsequently, it's absolutely fine if that assessment is undertaken by a teaching assistant. Equally, if your teaching assistant is really experienced with this stuff, it could be that they do that initial assessment and then just feed back to the teacher. But I think ideally the teacher's doing that first one. Ditto with subsequent decoding assessments. If a pupil has, you've done the fluency assessment, you think, I think there might be some issues with decoding here, or, they came across a word like shop and they try to say "sir hop," and you think, "Oh, hang on a minute, that looks like that they're missing that bit of code knowledge that S and H together tends to spell the sound sh." Then that follow-up assessment, that decoding assessment, can be done by a teacher. It can be done by a teaching assistant, as long as whoever is doing that is trained in how to do that and what to look for. In terms of interventions, in an ideal world, I think that a teacher would be running those perhaps partly, as I've done in the past, during things like assemblies or other parts of the school day where you can say, yeah, actually, once or twice a week or whatever it is, we can work together with that pupil. But the nature of these interventions and the nature of school life often means that teachers aren't available. They don't have the time to do that. I don't think it's problematic at all for a trained teaching assistant to be running these interventions, be they relating to decoding or relating to fluency. I mean, going back a step, one of the advantages of reading lesson structures is that you can take them and use them as interventions. So let's say that you, as a classroom teacher, run a fluency read lesson, which is basically repeated oral reading, where you do a bit of modeling, kids practice reading aloud afterwards, and then there's a brief kind of performance and discussion of that bit of text. Once you're by teaching that in the classroom on a, maybe twice, three times a week, whatever it might be, your teaching assistant gets to see you teaching in this way again and again and again and again. And so when you say, actually, we've got this group of 6 kids that need a bit of a boost with fluency, can you do an abbreviated version of what you see me do every Tuesday and Thursday? It's a lot less of a demanding ask because they've seen it done. Very often when interventions aren't done to a particularly high standard, it's because the person running that intervention, whether it's a teacher or a teaching assistant, hasn't seen something like that done before, doesn't know what an effective way of doing that looks like. So, long-winded answer to your question, but basically, fairly regular assessment, I think 3 times a year for the fluency and comprehension assessments, and then the decoding assessment that necessarily comes with that for certain kids. And in terms of who delivers those interventions, ideally a teacher, but a trained teaching assistant can absolutely work on these interventions. Now, do you have any other kind of practical questions around this stuff? Because I'm not sure if I answered everything you referred to.
No, I think you did. I think all the wind was necessary, because I mean, I regularly get emails past 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night from leaders, perhaps middle leaders, sometimes senior leaders, and I think one of the two bars I'm imagining to anyone who's thinking, right, okay, this is a system I'd like to implement, is if one person takes it on and then it adds to their workload, then they're you know they may be at capacity already. And equally, school day, with prioritization of absolutely everything at the moment, the school day is rammed. And so I think what you've done is you've outlined a very sensible approach to how leaders, and in my mind, you're sort of the person responsible for reading across the school plus the Senko working in collaboration with each other. But equally, there are many ways we can manage our day based on the outcomes of those assessments. So, as someone who's having conversations with people and seeing how almost, I thought we were moving towards a world where, our 45-hour week was becoming more and more of a reality. There's part of me that's thinking right now, I need to ask a question for those who may be at their limits. So yeah, so that's where I was coming from, and I think you've answered those questions, and it makes sense to me from a practical standpoint how we can manage this within the limits of the world in which we exist at the moment.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to add to that. The first is that I would never advocate anything in schools which I thought added to teacher workload. If the way that I advocate teaching reading in the book, the heart of the book, like kind of the reading lesson structures, the planning of those shouldn't take more time than any other approach to teaching reading that I've seen. Because, we know how hard teachers work. If you're saying to them, this is a great way to teach reading, and all you're going to need to do is add 2 hours a week planning time, that's not going to fly, because you're taking away from the time that they have to do all of the other jobs that teachers do, as well as have a life, see their family, etc. So that's one thing to note. The second thing to note more directly about this topic of assessing and addressing reading difficulties, I do think, and I talk about this in the book, it's ever so important that it isn't just left to teachers to do something. So, we know this kid's got decoding difficulties. We've got this systematic approach to assessment, but when it comes to interventions, we just want you to put something in place, and then we'll quiz you in pupil progress meetings about what you're doing. I think that has to come from the top. I think the top of the school has to say, okay, we've got these assessments in place. Because we've identified these kind of groups of pupils that are most likely to benefit from these particular interventions, this is how you can do that intervention. And when we're putting together a timetable, we'll work with you to work out, the best times for, whatever teaching assistant, whoever it might be, who is running these interventions, the best time for them to do that work in the school day to make sure that pupils are missing as little of the wider curriculum as possible. So yeah, I think we have to make sure that the reading lead and senior leaders in the school are taking charge of how we do assessment and how we run interventions, so that when it comes to pupil progress meetings, we can talk about, well, how well are the things that we have systematically across this school? How well are they working for these individual pupils? Are they in the right one? Do they need more time? Is it something else that actually might be holding them back at this stage? Rather than, just trying to see if we can get better results by pressurizing teachers. That's a complete non-starter as an approach.
A substantial amount of thought needs to be put into the texts we give pupils the opportunity to engage with. What advice would you give with regards to text selection?
One of the first things I'd note on this subject is that most of what we think of as our reading curriculum is those texts. It is that list of texts. It's not, as many schools have got in place, it's not a list of alleged kind of generic transferable skills. It isn't, a little tick list that says in, year 4, I can infer the emotions of a character, say. As you've heard me say on this podcast before, when it comes to interpreting the feelings of a character, well, is that Mr. Rochester's amorous regard for Jane Eyre, or is it Winnie the Pooh's desire for honey? These are very different levels of inference, very different levels of understanding of language in the wider world that's required to meet that criteria. All of these things, in other words, are completely text specific. So as soon as you try and put them in a generic statement and tick them off, it's just a complete waste of time. That isn't worth doing, and it isn't your reading curriculum. When you're thinking about your reading curriculum, and I will get onto text selection because that is the majority of it, part of your reading curriculum is your phonics scope and sequence, obviously, because you are teaching that and you're teaching it in order. That's part of your reading curriculum. And alongside that, you might state when and how certain reading comprehension strategies like summarizing and rereading, when they are taught or when you'll start to introduce them into your teaching of reading. You might do that as well. But most of your reading curriculum is that collection of texts that you are teaching. I think a really good starting point, and there's no real evidence to say do this or do that, but just I think a sensible starting point is to think of roughly 50%, maybe a bit more than that, but roughly 50% of your reading curriculum is the storybooks that you will teach. Entire, lengthy, carefully thought through in terms of your choice storybooks. I think class sets, ideally, I think it's very difficult to teach reading really well without class sets of texts, especially further up the school when we might want to build pupils' reading stamina and get them reading independently as part of reading lessons. Alongside that 50% of storybooks, I think generally primary schools have been very good at thinking through that part of their reading curriculum. Alongside that, there's the other half, which is, in effect, all the other kinds of texts that we might want to introduce pupils to. So short myths, poetry, information texts, speeches, brief biographies, etc. Now, that stuff is much harder to put together. That stuff is more about gradual accumulation. It's about saying, okay, I know I've got some storybooks, but I also want to read this information text that's connected to our history curriculum, or I really want to introduce them to this poetry. And over time, as a reading lead in interaction with your classroom teachers, it's about accumulating those other texts, copyright withstanding, saving them to your shared drive or whatever it might be, and gradually over a number of years getting to the point where you say, okay, we know we've got these storybooks in year 5 that maybe take up 50, 60, 70% of our reading time in reading lessons, but we've also got this other stuff. We also make sure that pupils are learning this poem at this point in the year, and they're learning about this bit of this speech, or this information text that connects to what we're about to learn in history. That stuff, ideally, if you can get that all together in one place, even maybe, again, copyright withstanding, photocopy it into a single booklet so that when year 5 come to read, it's all in one place, or year 3 come to read, it's all in one place. If you can do that, great. The last bit of advice that I might give in this area, or the last couple of bits of advice, first is that while it's okay to sometimes use extracts and to say, actually, we've been looking at this story, it has a fascinating story opening, let's contrast it with the story opening in this text that's in our reading corner, say. While using extracts strategically, it's sometimes a perfectly sensible thing to do. No problem with that. As a general rule, a lot of the reading that pupils are doing should involve them reading the entire text. You're not really learning about text structure. You're not really learning about narratives and the language involved with them if you are just reading little bits within them. I've worked with schools that will say to me, oh, well, we teach reading and we have class sets of storybooks, and yet they'll then say to me, but we only tend to get through the first third or the first half of the book before we move on. And again, if we're not showing pupils the entirety of texts, then I think that has to have an impact on their motivation to read, the purpose for reading that we're hoping for them to see. But also, we're not really building their knowledge of written language. Final thing to say is that thinking about that text selection, especially the storybooks, we need to be thinking about what I describe as 3 kinds of diversity. So diversity of perspective. So do pupils see themselves, their communities, and wider society reflected in the books that they read? We also want a diversity of content. So in a very simple way, if you've got a story set by the coast, it's lovely if then there are other stories set in, a bustling metropolis, or in a forest, or in a suburban area. This is just one small aspect of the kind of variety of content you might be looking for. It might also be, that this one's set in the past, or this one's set in this particular historical era that links to our history curriculum, or this one's set in this part of the world, which is a really nice connection to our geography curriculum when we're learning about volcanoes, or whatever it might be. And the final thing is kind of diversity of language as well. Are they seeing stories written in the past tense and the present tense? Are they seeing kind of modern, humorous books? Are they seeing more archaic language? Are they seeing something written in different eras, etc.? So just that general eye on a variety of language. Again, there's no really tight list of criteria that I can say you absolutely have to do these things. I give some general pointers in the book on building a reading curriculum, sure, but a more general sense of, is there a variety of perspective, content, and language, is a pretty good starting point when building a curriculum.
I mean, this might be totally irrelevant, but one thing I've noticed is that if a certain style of writing, or perhaps say we imagine books that were written in the Victorian era that have a very distinct and specific, I don't want to say archaic, but certainly more difficult to engage with style. And I find that if you introduce it too early, then that has a detrimental effect later on, further on down the line, perhaps than when the pupils may have been ready. Is that something you're considering? Is that something that's important, or is it just me who's focusing on the wrong thing?
I definitely think that we have to think carefully about when we're introducing certain difficulties with language. You're absolutely right. One of the things you'll note about any text, I mean, both texts aimed at adults and text aimed at children, is the way that sentence length has evolved over time. You know, you go back to something like The Secret Garden, the average sentence length in that, I would gamble, is longer than the vast majority of children's books that might be aimed at, 10, 11, 12-year olds now. And often that complexity of sentence structure, which is something we want to expose pupils to, we don't want to sacrifice their ability to understand and enjoy a text by saying, well, let's read The Secret Garden in year 3. Often we have situations where schools mistake ambition for, perhaps foolhardiness. And while we do want to be stretching pupils, we do want to think, you know what, they might not appreciate this or fully enjoy this without my support if they were going to read it on their own, but I think I can scaffold their understanding here enough that they can enjoy it. While we can do that, there is a sense in which we have to say sometimes, you know what, they're not, I just don't think they're going to appreciate this text. As a general rule, if you think you're going to have to stop to explain the meaning of a word every second sentence for them to make any sense of the text, then you're not going to develop that sense of flow at all. There is, as with any other area of teaching, a kind of sweet spot where, what might have previously been called, zone of proximal development, whatever you want to call it. There is a sweet spot in terms of the requirements placed on pupils in terms of their prior knowledge of language when it comes to choosing texts. And that is always a judgment call. That's always part of developing this reading curriculum. One thing I might say is that one way around that, if you're concerned about the difficulty of a text and you think, well, I'm not sure whether they're really going to get on board with it, and I guess we'll find out, is to pair that and to say, well, straight after we've read this quite challenging, possibly archaic, but it might not be, possibly, text from, a century ago, going to follow that up with something really accessible, something really modern, really accessible, really connected to their experiences in their modern lives. So we can balance that, we can offset that if we're worried about maybe stretching pupils a bit further than is ideal, and we're not sure whether we're going to get away with that.
The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I only have negative experiences of having to explain every sentence would have something, or perhaps the flow. So yeah, so I think your advice makes sense, and I think it's very much class specific, pupil specific, but you've got that broad sort of range of text on which to draw on. Yeah.
And just to add, you can think about how you are going to teach that book as well. So, for example, if I've got, say, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, one half term, and then after that, kids are reading something like There's a Boy in the Girl's Bathroom. Now, there is a stark difference in the difficulty of the language used in those two books, and it might be the case that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I am taking a greater role in reading aloud, describing things, explaining things, kind of basically scaffolding the reading a little bit more. Whereas with There's a Boy in the Girl's Bathroom, I might be doing more of, oh, okay, what I'd like you to do is to read these 2 pages and then we're going to discuss, because you're fairly confident that the class will be able to engage with that, make sense of it, to use the parlance, kind of build their own mental model, their own gist of what's going on with those 2 pages in a way that you might think they might not be able to just yet with that more complex text. So you can also adapt in subtle ways how you're doing that teaching.
Could you explain how we might develop a reading culture in a school?
Something that's a bit of a bugbear of mine is how often I will see schools who have loads of initiatives for reading for pleasure. And often these are initiatives, when I look at them, I think, wow, that's taken those teachers a lot of time. So they have all of these wonderful reading for pleasure initiatives. And then alongside that, their reading lessons will be glorified SAT practice, really tedious, repetitive, purposeless teaching. And those 2 things, it always surprises me how common it is for those 2 things to exist in a school side by side. When it comes to actually developing a culture, a reading culture, a culture where reading for pleasure is common, where pupils basically are encouraged to read independently, I think we can divide what we have to do into 2 broad categories. One of them is that we need to do everything in our power to ensure that as many pupils as possible, as quickly as possible, become capable, confident readers. Because kids who don't like reading, who are very commonly those who struggle with it. It's unsurprising, if you can't read, if you feel kind of silly or stupid compared to your peers because you're struggling with this thing that they seem to be finding easy, you're not going to want to engage with it, especially in your own free time. So that's the first thing we have to do. The second thing, more broadly, is that we have to show kids that reading is valued and that it's valuable. And as I mentioned before, that includes in how we teach our reading lessons. Now, that encompasses all sorts of things. So we can make pupils, or we can help pupils to recognize that reading is valued and valuable, for example, by reading aloud on a regular basis to pupils and making that sort of feel like a central part of our school day. We can make sure that there are spare copies available. Very often when pupils who are reluctant readers have heard a book read aloud to them, they will say to their teacher, well, actually, I'd quite like to read that one again. If you think about how comfortable we often find it to watch television series that we've seen before, and how it kind of strips out some of the cognitive difficulties and the emotional difficulties of dealing with something new, we can find like this little comfort zone within that. And the same is true for books that pupils have read. Very often, as I say, pupils who struggle with reading haven't really found that book that sparks their interest yet. It's often a book that's already been read to them that will do that. So that's something we can do. We can also make sure that, just generally speaking, books are accessible. If that means regular trips to the school library or even visits to a local library, if that's available to you. If that means having kids curating the reading corner, and that's a great thing to do, so that word starts to spread about interesting books and recommendations. Another thing, thinking about recommendations, is us as teachers recommending books to kids. Occasionally, it can be a really powerful thing to say to a kid, I think you'll like this book. Based on what you've previously said, what I know about you, what you've said about reading, whatever it might be, I think you might like this. Without over pressurizing it, we don't want to say, I know you'll love this, because you know what it's like when someone recommends something to you and actually it isn't quite your cup of tea. So without pressurizing, recommending books to kids, making sure that there's a focus on non-fiction. Very often school libraries and school reading corners don't quite have as much attention paid to non-fiction as they do to fiction. There are plenty of kids where that will be the thing that sparks their love of reading. Another thing is to not limit kids in their text choices. Now, when they're first moving on to reading practice themselves independently with, in inverted commas, normal books rather than decodable books, then careful recommendations, carefully helping them to choose things that will provide a nice gradual introduction to that kind of thing. That's really important. But as a general rule, beyond that, I think where we categorize books and say, okay, you should read orange books or lime banded books, or whatever it might be, I don't see that as productive. If you've got those labels on your books, then they can still be useful for teachers, so they can get a sense of roughly how difficult certain books are in their book corner or in the school library, that might help them when they're making recommendations. But saying to kids, no, this little narrow band of books is the one that matches your capability right now, and that means these are the only ones you can take home and read, I don't think that's a particularly good idea. Not least because there have been a number of times where I've been working with struggling readers, and the thing that's really sparked their interest in reading is when they've picked up and read, often multiple times, a book that usually you might see as being far too difficult for them. It's often a book that they see and in their words, their clever friends reading. It's often when they engage with something like that and understand it and start to feel clever and capable themselves that they fall in love with reading. So the idea of saying, oh, okay, no, I need to match this difficulty of book to you because you have this particular capability right now, I'm not a fan of it. I think we lose far more than we gain by restricting people's book choices in that way. Equally, we want to find excuses to talk about reading in class and to get kids talking about reading. That might be, you get 30 seconds here or there before lunch and you think, how am I going to use this time? Oh no, I'll grab a book out of the book corner and I'll read the blurb and I'll say, my class last year loved this book. This one's over here if you fancy it. Just occasionally finding reasons, excuses to talk about what books you like, what's in the book corner, what books other kids have been reading. That's a really lovely, informal thing to do. I guess the final thing that I would say is how we can indirectly do this through engaging parents with reading, making sure that the reading that kids do at home for homework, that's a priority, that it's something that we discuss at parents' evening. But all of that aside, we have to bear in mind that ultimate responsibility for teaching reading lies with the school, with us as teachers. Anything that parents do to help is wonderful, it's appreciated, but it's a bonus. We mustn't rely on it for the sake of those pupils who don't have that support.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one because it can be such an emotive topic, and it can also be frustrating from the point of view of the adult who wants the child to enjoy reading as much as they do. But it's almost like the when the wall is up, it takes a lot. So I think that advice is both actionable and will be really, really useful for both teachers and just adults in general, I think.
I mean, thinking about restricting text choices, I certainly think there's value in a teacher knowing what pupils read as well. Perhaps starting the year with a survey, talking to your pupils, finding out, well, what do you like about reading lessons? What kind of books do you like, etc. That's a really valuable. I mean, as I said before, pretty much anything that you can do to show kids that you value reading and that reading is valuable to them, that's that's going to be helpful. It's almost impossible to think of something that fits that kind of description that's going to be a bad idea for developing a love of reading. And part of that might be, yes, we want to recommend books to kids, and yes, we might want to find out what they read. That doesn't mean us then saying, oh, okay, well, I only want you to read, this kind of book because I know this is a kind of book you haven't read yet. Sometimes there's a balance to be played there. A kid who is a bit of a reluctant reader has just fallen in love with graphic novels or with information texts or whatever it might be, and you're delighted with that, and after a few months you find that's the only thing that they read. There's a delicate balance there. You might want to gently suggest how they might broaden their horizons, but equally, if they're reading and they're loving reading, sometimes it's better not to rock the boat. So we've got to be quite careful in when we're thinking about recommended books to kids, and when we're thinking about how we might expand their horizons, we also have to make sure that we recognize as teachers that there are a whole variety of types of texts that might turn pupils onto reading, and it isn't necessarily your classic 300-page storybook that is the only thing that we should be advising pupils to read.
The Science and Art of Teaching Primary Reading is out in January, is that right?
The actual title is Primary Reading Simplified. It is out in January. If you're on Amazon, it will say released in February. Apparently, that's intentionally pessimistic. It almost certainly should be out in January. Not sure why January. It was just the way that the timings worked. I hope that people are willing to engage with it in the darkest, coldest, most depressing point in the year. I hope that it warms the cockles for some people at that time of year. But yeah, I'm really excited for it to come out. It was a huge labour of love. The first book I wrote in a summer holiday because I'd thought about lots of stuff and it was all in my head and I just needed to get it down. This book took 18 months of toil, and I think, being perfectly honest, I think it's on a completely different level to the first book. I think people were far too generous in some of the nice things they said about the first book. I think it's fine. I think this second book is something that I am much more proud about. And I really hope that people who read the first book, and even people who haven't read the first book, will be willing to give this second one a try.
I think Kid A is 24 years old as we were recording, on the day we were recording. So do you think this is your Kid A, where it's so good, it's still going to be futuristic 24 years in the future?
No, I'd like to say I like to think that this is more my OK computer because the Benz is, a good album. Nothing wrong with it. But with hindsight, it's got nothing on OK Computer. That is the one where they really become, where Radiohead really become, I think, who they are. And I imagine that's an album that they're much more proud of than the Bends. And that's, I can't, we can't have that. I can't compare the book that I've written to my favorite ever album.
Too late. And
Too
I'm
late.
assuming in
No, no.
your blog is Pablo Honey in this scenario.
Oh yeah, no, nothing's Pablo Honey. Nothing's Pablo Honey. Um, yeah, no, yeah, I am absolutely, I'm, I'm probably too proud of this second book and what it represents. I think it's by far and away the best thing I've ever done with my life. So
Wow.
please buy it.
Yeah, well, I mean, if the last one's anything to go by, then people are really going to enjoy this one too. So, I mean, just to remind everybody that tickets are available for the Thinking Deeply About Primary Education conference on January 18th. It'd be great to see you there in aid of a great cause. All that's left to do is to say thank you very much for joining me, Chris.
Thanks for having me, Kieran. Always a pleasure.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.